Most people who know anything about Rumi know him through the short pieces, the quotes that travel on social media, the popular English translations, the lyric ghazals from the Divan of Shams. That is not the work I want to talk about today. The work I want to talk about is the Masnavi. 6 books, around 25,000 verses. Rumi worked on it across most of the last decade and a half of his life, and when he died in 1273, it was still unfinished. He was not writing it for popularity, and he was not writing it for an audience that did not yet exist. He was writing it because his student Hosamuddin asked him to, and because there was something that had to come out of him in this specific form. The Persian-speaking world has a name for the Masnavi. They call it the Quran in Persian. That phrase often gets misunderstood. Persian readers across the centuries were not claiming that Rumi was imitating scripture or competing with it. They were recognizing that the Masnavi was doing the same kind of work that scripture does, in their own language, addressed to a level of the human being that ordinary religious instruction does not reach. Rumi himself called the Masnavi the roots of the roots of the roots of religion. Notice the triple. He is saying there is a layer below the surface of religious practice, and then a layer below that, and then a layer below that again. The Masnavi is written for the bottom layer, the one that almost no one ever gets to. I have been reading the Masnavi for years now. I read it in the original Persian, slowly, and the longer I sit with it, the more convinced I become that what is on the surface of the standard commentary tradition, however learned, is missing the level the text is actually working on. The text is doing something more radical than the commentaries describe. And the place where this radicalism is most compressed and most often missed is in the opening 18 verses of the poem, the section called the Song of the Reed. In this video, I want to go into the first 8 of those verses, slowly, one at a time. I want to show you what the verses are actually doing, and why the reading you have probably encountered before, while it has its merits, stops short of what the poem is asking for. Let me describe the standard reading first, so you can see what I'm setting aside. The standard reading goes something like this. The reed has been cut from its reed bed. The reed bed represents the divine source. The cutting is the soul's descent into the world. The wailing of the reed is the soul's longing to return home. And the whole poem becomes a song of exile and reunion. This reading is taught in Persian schools. It is repeated in every classical commentary. And the text does support it on the surface, because the vocabulary really is there. The reading is not wrong, exactly. The reading simply stays on a level that the poem itself is asking us to go beneath. Here's what I mean. If the reed has been cut and longs to return, then the poem becomes a narrative inside time. Something happened, the cutting. Something else will happen later, the return. And the speaker is in the gap between. That is a story. And as a story, it imports the very assumption that Rumi spent his life dismantling. The assumption that there are 2 things, a source over there, a separated soul over here, a distance between them, and a journey required to close that distance. If that picture is the truth, then liberation becomes a future event. You are not free yet. You will be free when you complete the journey. Salvation lives somewhere up ahead, and your life is the road to it. Rumi knew this picture was wrong, and not theoretically. He knew it the way you know your own face. And the Masnavi is what he wrote when he tried to put what he knew into a form that other minds could enter. So the question becomes, what is the Song of the Reed actually doing, if it is not telling a story of exile and reunion? What I want to suggest, and what I will spend this video and the videos that follow working out, is that the Song of the Reed stages the structure of being a separated thing. The poem performs that structure on the page, lets it become audible to itself, and in that audibility, the structure dissolves. Nothing changes in the moment of recognition. Nothing was ever hidden in the first place. That's what I mean by a deeper interpretation. The same words, read with attention to what they are actually doing, instead of what they appear at first to be saying. Let me show you. The first verse. Listen to this reed, how it complains. It tells the story of separations. The very first word in the original Persian is the imperative form of the verb to listen. And immediately a question opens up. Who is being addressed? Who is the listener that this poem is calling out to? If you read the poem at the level of story, the listener is you, the reader, the seeker. The reed is over there, somewhere, complaining, and you are sitting here receiving its complaint. But notice something about a reed flute itself. A reed flute is hollow. Sound passes through it. The breath of the player generates the music, and the reed shapes the breath into sound. The reed itself is in some real sense the most attentive listener in the entire room. It listens to the breath, and what it hears is what it then speaks. So the instruction, listen to this reed, is doing more than calling for your attention. It is a riddle about what listening itself even is. Now, here is the second thing happening in this verse, which is invisible in any English translation. In the original Persian, the word that means complaint and the word that means story share almost the same sound. They differ by a single letter. And Rumi places them at the end of consecutive lines in rhyming position, so the listener cannot possibly miss the doubling. The complaint and the story are sonically the same thing. The complaint is the story. There is no complaint without the telling of it. There is no telling that is not, at some level, already a complaint. And then there is a third thing, which most translations also lose. The word for separations in the second line is in the plural form. Not one separation, many. The plural form is used deliberately so that every separation that has ever happened or that can ever happen becomes what the reed is sounding. That single grammatical detail tells you the poem is not about one specific historical cut. It is about the structure of being a separated thing as such. Every place anyone has ever felt cut off from anything. From a beloved, from a country, from a younger version of themselves, from God, from their own life. All of these are what the reed is sounding, because they all have exactly the same shape. This is the first sign that the poem is operating one level deeper than biography or even cosmology. The poem is operating at the level of structure itself. The second verse. Since they cut me from the reed bed, men and women have wept at my cry. Notice what the reed does not say here. The reed does not say, I have wept since I was cut. The reed says, men and women have wept at my cry. The reed reports the effect of its own sound on other people. The reed does not testify to its own grief directly. This matters quite a lot, because the standard reading wants the reed to be the suffering soul, weeping endlessly for its lost home. The reed in the actual text is something more interesting than that. The reed is the instrument through which other people weep. The reed is sounding. The sound, when it reaches a human being, opens something in that human being that lets them weep. The grief was already there inside the listener. The reed simply gives that grief permission to surface. Now think about the cut itself. To make a reed flute, you take a reed. You cut it from the bed where it was growing. You hollow out its inside. You bore holes into its body. The wounding is what makes it an instrument. A whole reed still standing in the reed bed makes no music at all. The reed bed is silent. The cutting is precisely what opens the channel through which music can pass. So the phrase, since they cut me, is doing something other than complaining. The phrase is naming the condition that makes the speaking possible in the first place. The reed is saying, in effect, this voice you are hearing right now, this very voice, exists only because of the cut. Without the cut, there is no voice. Without the voice, there is no listener. Without the listener, there is no opening in the listener for the sound to enter into. You start to see how quickly this stops being a story about loss. The third verse. I want a chest shredded by separation so that I may speak the meaning of longing. This is one of the hardest verses in the opening for a modern reader to take in. Because Rumi here is saying that he wants the wound. He does not want it from any taste for pain. He wants it from understanding the relationship between wound and witness. In the original Persian, the word for shredded, torn into pieces, and the word for explanation or commentary share the same root. They sound nearly identical when spoken, and they appear right next to each other in the verse. The shredding and the explaining are linked at the root. The wound is its own commentary. What Rumi is saying then is this: I want a chest torn open so that the tearing itself can speak. I have no interest in describing longing from the outside as a spectator. I want longing to write itself directly through me. This is a very different theory of speech from the one most of us assume. We tend to assume that in order to speak about something, you have to stand back from it. You observe it. You form concepts about it. You articulate those concepts. Rumi is offering a different theory entirely. The deepest kind of speech is the wound becoming visible from its own inside. The speaker does not stand outside what they are describing. The speaker becomes the place where the thing becomes audible to itself. Hold on to this idea, because the seventh verse is going to come back to it and pay it off completely. The fourth verse. Whoever has remained far from his origin seeks again the time of his own union. This is the most famous verse of the 8, and it is also the verse that is most often misread. The standard reading takes the word origin and the word union as referring to a real prior historical state. The reading goes like this: There was a time when you and your origin were together. Now you are not. Therefore, you seek to return back to that prior time. Look more carefully at the words Rumi actually uses. The Persian phrase translates literally to the time of his own union. The word own is doing essential work here. Rumi does not say the union with the origin. Rumi says the time of his own union. Union is being described as a quality of the seeker himself, an intimate property, something belonging to the seeker. What Rumi is doing here, very quietly, is locating union inside the very one who feels the distance. The longing for union is union appearing in the form of longing. The seeker, in the very moment of seeking, is already the site of what is being sought. If you read this verse as a temporal story about returning to a past state, you will spend your entire life chasing something that always remains a step ahead of you. If you read it as a structural description of what longing actually is, you may notice that whatever is reading the poem right now is already on the other side of the description. The verse has a second blade as well. The opening phrase, whoever, means anyone, everyone. The condition that Rumi names is universal. The condition is not a special spiritual problem reserved for advanced seekers. Every single person who has ever been at a distance from anything seeks reunion. That is simply what it is to be a person. The poem is not describing a religious vocation for the few. The poem is describing the basic shape of being human. The fifth verse. In every gathering I have wailed, I have been companion to those in bad states and to those in good. The reed plays the same note in every room. The reed does not adjust its sound to match the mood of whatever audience happens to be present. Around the joyful, the reed still sounds what it sounds. Around the grieving, the same. What this means is that the reed's voice does not respond to circumstance. The voice comes from a level below the emotional weather of any particular gathering. The voice sounds the structure of being a person, and that structure underlies every joy and every grief that any particular person might happen to be feeling at any particular time. Notice also the construction of the verb in the original. The Persian phrase translates literally as, "I became wailing." The construction is not "I wailed" as one discrete action among other actions. The construction is, "I became one who wails." The wailing is not an activity that the reed performs from time to time. The wailing is the mode of being. To be a reed in this poem is to be a wailing. This is important for everything that follows. Because if the wailing is what the reed actually is, then the wailing is not a problem to be solved. The wailing is simply the form that the reed's existence takes. The Masnavi as a whole is going to keep returning to this same recognition that the longing of the human heart is not a malfunction in need of correction. The longing is the shape of being human itself. The 6th verse, "Each became my friend from his own conjecture. None sought my secrets from within me." The word translated here as conjecture is a particular Persian word that means opinion, supposition, guess. The same word the Quran uses to name the kind of belief that does not amount to real knowledge. Each person who befriends the reed projects their own assumptions onto it. They map the reed according to what they already expect to hear. And then the second line lands sharply. "None sought my secrets from within me." The secrets, the reed says, are inside. The listeners are all standing on the outside. They befriend the surface of the reed without ever entering into its interior. But here's the move. A reed flute simply is its inside. The inside, the hollow, is what produces the sound in the first place. To approach the reed from the outside only is to miss the very thing that the reed has to offer. The friend who befriends a reed by conjecture is befriending the surface of an instrument that they have never actually played. Rumi is naming something extremely important here. Rumi is naming the structural failure of most spiritual reading, including most reading of his own work. We read mystics by conjecture. We import our own assumptions about what they must have meant. We make the text say what we already expect it to say. And then we call this understanding. The text becomes the surface of an instrument that we never actually play. This verse is also Rumi's quiet instruction to his reader. To read what comes next, you cannot stand on the outside of the poem. You have to enter it from the inside, which means you have to enter the place inside yourself that the poem comes from. The poem will not yield to anyone who reads it from the outside as an object. The 7th verse, "My secret is not far from my wailing, but the eye and the ear do not have that light." This is the verse where the poem quietly gives away its method. The secret, the reed says, is not somewhere else. The secret is not hidden behind the wailing. The secret is not somewhere deeper, in some text that the wailing is merely pointing toward. The secret is in the wailing itself. The wailing is the secret, in its only available form. Go back for a moment to the 3rd verse, where Rumi said he wanted a chest shredded so that the shredding itself could speak. This 7th verse is the same idea, now stated directly. The wound is the commentary. The wailing is the secret. The form of the suffering is the meaning of the suffering. There is no extra hidden layer behind any of it. Then the second line of the verse, "The eye and the ear do not have the light necessary to see it." Why is that? Because the eye and the ear apprehend objects. The eye and the ear operate in the structure of subject and object. The eye sees a thing. The seer is here, and the thing seen is over there. The ear hears a thing. The hearer is here, and the heard sound is over there. The reed's secret, however, is not an object at all. The reed's secret is not a thing that the wailing happens to contain. The secret is the wailing itself, viewed from a place where the viewer has not been split off from the viewing. The eye and the ear are made of separation. They are the very instruments by which subject and object are kept distinct from one another. That is what they are for. So the eye and the ear cannot possibly reach a place where subject and object turn out to be the same. They are simply the wrong tools for this job. To hear the reed actually, you would have to listen with something that is not on the outside of what it is hearing. The verse is telling you what such a listening would require, and then telling you, very honestly, that ordinary perception does not have it. This is where the poem begins to do its real work on the reader. Because if eye and ear cannot reach the secret, what can? The poem will not answer that question directly. The poem will instead keep wailing, line after line after line, and trust that somewhere inside the wailing, the listener will stop listening as an object-receiving organ and start listening as something else entirely. The 8th verse, the last one we are looking at today. Body is not hidden from soul, nor soul from body, but no one has the permission to see the soul. The word translated here as hidden is a particular Persian word that means veiled, concealed. The verse is saying that body and soul are not veiled from each other. They are not two separate things, one of which conceals the other. That sentence alone, taken seriously, undoes most of the dualism in the spiritual literature of the last 1,000 years. Body and soul are not two regions with a veil hanging between them. They are not separated entities at all. The hiddenness that people generally assume between body and soul is simply not there. The second line, no one has the permission to see the soul. The word translated here as permission means decree, sanction, license. Why no permission if there is no veil? This is the most important sentence in the whole opening of the Masnavi, so I'm going to slow down. There is no permission to see the soul because there is no soul as object available to be seen. The soul is not a thing located inside the body that one might extract and inspect from the outside. The soul is what is doing the seeing in the first place. The soul is the seer. For someone to see the soul would require turning the seer into the seen, which would require a second seer to do the new seeing, which would require a third seer to see that second seer, and the regress has no end. What Rumi is saying then is that the failure to see the soul has nothing whatsoever to do with a veil. There is no veil. The failure comes from the very structure of seeing itself. Seeing implies a seer and a seen. The soul is the seer. The soul cannot become the seen without ceasing to be the soul. This is the deepest of the 8 verses, and this is what sets up the entire arc of the Masnavi to come. There is no hidden divine reality that you are separated from somewhere out there. The thing you are looking for is the very thing doing the looking. The reason it cannot be found is not that it is far away. The reason it cannot be found is that finding it would require it to be other than what is currently doing the finding. Read that second line one more time, in your own ear. No one has the permission to see the soul. The phrase "no one" here is not a moral judgment, as though some people might eventually earn the permission and others might not. The phrase is structural. There is no one who could ever be granted this permission, because the soul is already what any granted person would already be. The very being of the seeker is what the seeker is forbidden, in this sense, to see. And so the wailing continues. The reed keeps sounding, because the wailing is the only way that the unseeable soul can ever become audible to itself. The wailing is the soul listening to itself through the channel of a hollowed body. That is a lot of ground, and I have said almost nothing about most of it. Each one of these 8 verses could easily hold a video of its own, and I plan to come back to them slowly, one at a time, in the videos that follow this one. What I wanted to do in this first video was simply open the door enough that you can see why I think the standard reading, the reading of Exile and Return, is not the reading the poem itself is actually asking for. The Song of the Reed is not a song of homesickness from a soul stranded far away from God. The Song of the Reed is a description of a structure that, the moment you see it clearly, dissolves. The wailing is the audible form of that structure. The audibility is the dissolution. In the next video, I will go back to the very first verse and I will stay there. Listen to this reed, how it complains. There is more in that single first line than I have given it here today. There is more in the imperative, listen. There is more in the demonstrative, this reed, this one. There is more in the question of who, exactly, is being asked to do the listening. For now, sit with these 8 verses. Read them aloud if you have access to Persian. Read them aloud in translation if you do not. Let the doubling of complaint and story sound in your ear. Let the plural form of separations register. Let the verse about no permission settle quietly into you. The poem is not waiting for you to figure it out. The poem is already doing its work on you, line by line, as you listen. That, I think, is what Rumi meant by the roots of the roots of the roots.